Our next presenter is Jamie Lorimer. Jamie Lorimer is an associate professor in the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. Jamie's research explores the geographies and politics of wildlife conservation. Recent work has focused on the emergence of rewilding as a new way of doing conservation, tracing the history of the concept and disputes over its different meanings. Jamie is especially interested in conservation in unorthodox settings and had worked previously on the ambiguous status of the urban in conservation. He has recently published a book entitled Wildlife in the Anthropocene, Conservation After Nature. This monograph gathers together ideas developed over the last decade to examine the implications of the Anthropocene for the natures and politics of conservation. Jamie Lorimer.
Thank you to all the members of the project team for inviting me across here. I've never been to Toronto before, and it's great to be here. I'm still on UK time, so I was up at 4 o'clock this morning, had plenty of time to walk around the campus and see various urban wilds in action. I've never seen black squirrels before. So my talk, I guess, will pick up on some of the themes that Sue introduced first up, but also give a couple of case studies that might allow us to think through some of the more conceptual points that Ramsey was mentioning in his previous talk. Broadly speaking, I want to reflect on the relationships between wildness and the urban, so to open up those two categories. I'm a geographer by training, and as a geographer, I've tended to think in terms of maps. So I thought I'd sketch out a couple of abstractions that I found helpful in my teaching to try and illustrate the geographies of the urban and the wild that were prevalent in Europe and North America during the 19th and the 20th century. So on the left, as we look at it here, the wilds are hostile places. They're full of dangerous beasts, nasty diseases, unpredictable weather, and backwoods people. The urban is the locus of civilization, the place free from the hostilities of nature and natural law. The diagram on the right reverses these two poles. So here the city is the site of degradation, domesticity, and alienation. And the wilds are desired places to be found out there, in sublime landscapes, inhabited by noble savages thoroughly connected to nature. This is a caricature, of course, but the tendencies in his sketches have been central to North American conceptions of the relationship between the city and the wilds. They embody what we might broadly understand to be a modern on the left and a romantic sensibility on the right. Both of these models are founded on the binary separation between people and nature, so they find the idea of urban rewilding oxymoronic, i.e. a contradiction in terms. In both cases here, the urban is the antithesis of the wild. Now, I don't think this ought to be the case, but I think we can take these diagrams as points of departure for a model of 21st century conservation that might be quite different from its forebears. In my work, I'm especially interested in how conservation might come to terms with the event of the Anthropocene, and I guess many of you will be becoming familiar with that term and all its vagaries. By this I refer to the scientific proposal that the planet has entered a new epoch by virtue of the magnitude of human impacts and the ensuing political and popular debates that this led to. So the Anthropocene here promises an epoch in which a pure green nature, at least in the terms that I was sketching it out there, has come to an end. A wild nature, the sort of red nature, is a clear and present danger, but it would be a red-green hybrid. It wouldn't be some kind of pure thing. It would be very much of anthropogenic origin. So it's brown. It's a kind of green-brown, green-red hybrid. So we can think in the way of the Anthropocene as a monster in various shades of muddy brown. And in this paper I want to make a case for how we might learn to love brown urban wilds. So to get over that fixation that the urban is green, or that nature is necessarily a hostile thing, sketched out in red. There are two provocative developments in 21st conservation that guide my argument. So the first of which is an intervention that you might have come across, a group of people claiming a style of thought that terms itself post-environmentalist. So this is most associated with an influential group of thinkers at the Breakthrough Institute. This is a US think tank. Authors affiliated with this think tank have recently published what they call an eco-modernist manifesto. And this resolutely optimistic piece argues that it might be possible to create a good Anthropocene. And they hope this will be achieved through new technology, through urbanisation, and further rounds of socio-economic modernisation. They argue and the point that's most relevant for my talk, that the good Anthropocene will result from the decoupling of people from nature, not through their harmonisation. So harmonisation is the problem with antiquated 20th century environmentalism. They say we need to decouple people from nature. Thinkers associated with this group have developed this thinking to offer what they claim is a new model of conservation. So particularly Peter Carrieva, who's the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy Council. My second touchstone is rewilding, which again is a kind of buzzword you might have come across. This is a very variegated, at times contradictory collection of approaches to wildlife conservation. But broadly speaking, rewilding aims to introduce or reintroduce keystone species to restore ecological processes. It aims to shift conservation towards prehistoric baselines. And I'll say more about rewilding as the paper goes on. The emergence of rewilding has coincided with and in some ways been powered up by the eco-modernists. So some of the eco-modernists are keen advocates of rewilding. And it features prominently in the discussions around new forms of conservation. So my talk is structured to address three questions that relate to the relationship between the urban and the wild. So the first of which, or in order, are what, when and where wildlife is supposed to be in the Anthropocene. And I'll take each of these in turn. But before doing so, I want to ground this in a case study. And this is a case study of the Oostvaardersplassen, which is a polder in the Netherlands, best abbreviated to the OVP. So I'll talk about the OVP rather than the Oostvaardersplassen because it's quite a mouthful. So the Oostvaardersplassen, and I'll zoom in on it here, so you get a sense of where we're going. We're looking in on that island there. Is a piece of land that was reclaimed from the sea in the 1950s but never developed. It forms part of the Flevoland, which is the largest artificial island in the world. It sits a couple of metres below sea level and is pumped to keep it partly dry. It was supposed to become an oil refinery, but instead it was colonised by geese, whose grazing kept the site open. Its importance and potential for wildlife was championed by the ecologist Frans Vera and his colleagues at Staatsbosbeheer, which is the Dutch Nature Conservation Authority. As a result of their advocacy, the site was designated as a nature reserve. And Vera subsequently orchestrated the introduction of hardy breeds of cattle and horses, as well as deer. These animals were allowed to de-domesticate themselves in an effort to approximate the wild behaviours and grazing regimes that, in Vera's opinion, would have characterised Europe at the end of the last ice age. The site is judged to be too small for the introduction of wolves, though the wolf itself has recently made its own way to the Netherlands from Germany, much to the delight of some in the polders. So this is a pretty bland landscape, and the local planners have been promoting the wolf as a kind of ethos of the site. This is a place for pioneers, they suggest in the effort. So Vera is interested in the herbivores, in the cattle and horses, as ecological engineers, whose grazing would address the trophic cascade caused by their absence. So as is common in rewilding, he's less interested in the composition of the landscape and more in the processes and functions that deliver a diversity of species. The experiment has been running for over 30 years and has produced some surprising ecological results. And in some ways, the management here is akin, I think, to what Ramsey was talking about as an inactivist philosophy. We talked about this as a wild experiment with kind of indeterminate outcomes. Although it's framed about replicating the past, in some ways it's quite future orientated, and the cows and horses have been allowed to find their own way into the landscape. In the Netherlands, the OVP was to be a central node of an ambitious project towards what they call nature development, which I guess for those of us in the UK and in North America is an oxymoron, but for the Dutch that's not a problem. You can have nature development. And nature development would involve creating a network of new natures on reclaimed or former agricultural land. Rewilding at the Oostvaardersplassen has inspired a wider initiative towards rewilding Europe. And this organisation wants to seize the opportunities caused by large-scale land abandonment, currently underway in marginal areas of Europe, to rewild 1 million hectares of land. Where necessary, they aim to reintroduce keystone species like large herbivores and apex predators. So what might rewilding at the Oostvaardersplassen tell us about wildlife in the urban and the Anthropocene more generally? Ecologists suggest that we should look at sites like the Oostvaardersplassen as novel ecosystems. This is a new conceptualization which has first emerged as an alternative way of thinking about what the non-human world is and its conservation. So according to one definition, novel ecosystems are human-built, modified, or engineered niches of the Anthropocene. They exist in places that have been altered in structure and function by human agency. As Sue mentioned Earl Ellis, and in fact the typology presented here is I think the same typology that was in the map that you showed. Earl Ellis is one of the authors of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, and he's developed this concept to reclassify global biogeographies into a series of anthromes, which are sketched on the diagram here. These can be arranged along an axis from wild to used according to their human population density, land use, land cover, and the provenance of their biotic community, the degree to which it's native or exotic in these terms. So here the human impacts associated with the Anthropocene Great Acceleration scramble established biogeographies of what might belong where. As new land, it's a little hard to place the Oostvaardersplassen on this diagram, but we might assume it's been tracking from right to left. Managing this novel ecosystem involves calibrating drainage regimes, removing undesired arrivals like North American mink, which is an invasive species in Europe, and wild boar, but also partly simulating predation regimes. So one of the interesting and most controversial tensions is around managing populations of large herbivores, which quite quickly grew in the absence of the wolf. Here the reserve manager controls the populations through what's called a predator simulation population management model. So he explained how he becomes wolf to decide which animals will not make it through the winter. But of course we know very little about what wolves would do with cows, so he has to check the condition of cows against welfare scoring systems developed in the dairy. So there's this real interesting fudge between laboratory spaces, land spaces, that way. Okay. Meanwhile, in high-profile journals, North American rewilding advocates have suggested importing African elephants and lions as surrogates for their now extinct North American ecological equivalent. So this is a version of what's called Pleistocene rewilding. While the introduction of elephants has been proposed as a technique for managing invasive African grasses in Australia. In Siberia, a Russian scientist is building support for the reincarnation or de-extinction of the mammoth to restore the tundra to grassland. These are all papers in Nature and Science published in the last sort of 5 or 6 years or so. So in these examples, we learn that nature in the Anthropocene is a novel ecosystem characterized not by a singular stable state, but by tipping points and multiple possible desired future natures. This thinking reframes ecologies as nonlinear systems driven by specific processes and functions, and most significantly, humans are in the picture as kind managers or enlightened engineers. My second set of reflections relate to the temporalities of conservation, so when was wildlife in the Anthropocene? Coupling concepts of rewilding with those of novel ecosystems challenges some of the orthodox temporalities of when we think nature is or was. So for example, experiments like the Oostvaardersplassen shift the target baseline for conservation from the pre-modern, so before the advent of industrial agriculture in Europe, to the prehistoric. It allows conservationists to reference some more ambitious and exciting landscapes. So we have Pleistocene rather than Jurassic parks, but the same kind of quasi-science fiction notion is at work. At the same time, the non-analog character of novel ecosystems permits ecologists to become more future-orientated. Rewilding here gives way to plain wilding, at least in theory, if not in practice. Reincarnated mammoths, elephants in Australia, lions in America, are more in keeping with the future ecologies of, say, Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy than the stable ecologies of Downton Abbey that predominate in the kind of UK model of conservation. So, honest ecologists in the Anthropocene accept that we do not know what any ecology will become as the planet shifts states. But of course this doesn't mean we shouldn't care about the conditions that enable their future emergence. As such, the experiments at the Oostvaardersplassen were not designed to prove a clearly framed hypothesis. Instead, they seek to generate surprises, unexpected, though often explicable events that show ecologies adapting. So when you speak to the site managers, they're very pleased about the fact that sea eagles, white-tailed eagles, arrived nesting below sea level, which of course has never been mapped historically. They said, yeah, this would never happen, but look, they've arrived, they've made use of this kind of accidental ecology that's here. or that vultures returned to the Netherlands. They don't have vultures in the Netherlands in living memory. The vultures were attracted by the dead meat of the large herbivores, and they survived until they got hit by the train that runs alongside the site. Third set of reflections relate to the different geographies of wilding enacted at the Oostvaardersplassen. So on the one hand, examples like the Oostvaardersplassen imagine a networked ecology of corridors, eco-ducts, so these are bridges that the Dutch build to allow wildlife to pass over bits of infrastructure. The map on the left shows the what's called the ecological main structure. This is the central part of the Nature Development Plan at the heart of this initiative. So although spaces like the Oostvaardersplassen are not to be subject to any form of agriculture, they do try and weave wildlife into the suburban matrix that makes up the Netherlands. So it's not quite a model of land sharing, to use the popular terms of discussion and conservation, but it does afford some consideration to wildlife within the everyday urban spaces of most people's lives. So it's quite different from those divided maps that I opened my talk with. A different geography predominates in the discussions of Rewilding Europe. So this is the organisation that's kind of inspired by this example but wants to take it out into the marginal areas, rural areas. This group is particularly keen on this idea of decoupling. And decoupling, of course, involves much more binary geography than we see here. They imagine a much more binary separation, a kind of model of land sparing, in which there would be spaces for nature and would be spaces for people. So their publicity materials offer two very striking visualizations. So this is the first one. We have a largely unpopulated Europe. The continent has been given over to a somewhat incongruous collection of charismatic animals. These kind of wallabies in Scotland, which I've never seen before. But there's this sense of, kind of magnificent wild landscapes in which there's only really one person in the Netherlands in that way. The second image is I think, more interesting and somewhat more subtle. And here we learn of the unravelling associated with the rise of modern agriculture, which is being rewoven again towards a future sustainability. So you've got this kind of DNA double helix story, as well as a kind of picture of cornucopia, which is a famous European image, in which a future sustainability involves a binary separation between the urban in the background and kind of charismatic wild animals in the foreground. In this version, wildlife is mapped onto the familiar modern geographies of the wilderness, from which any low-intensity productive livelihoods seem to be removed. The urban takes on a rather paradoxical position. So on the one hand, urbanisation is a good thing. It creates space for nature, it offers a respite for nature. By moving to the cities, we will spare land for wildlife. But on the other hand, urbanisation is understood to cause a pathological disconnection from nature. Rewilding enthusiasts attribute a host of psychological, social, cultural problems to living in cities. This is the kind of nature deficit disorder story that you've come across. There's been little discussion to date in the rewilding movement about the possibilities of rewilding the cities or rewilding the suburbs. Instead, people are to be reconnected through occasional forms of wildland ecotourism, none of which, of course, would involve any productive use of the land. So there's a kind of binary geography that's getting played out in this version. So this belief in decoupling would seem to maintain the modern myth of separating people from nature. Bruno Latour, the famous French theorist who was once a fellow at the Breakthrough Institute and had some kind of connections with these people, is very critical of the eco-modernist agenda and almost by extension the model of future urban-rural relationships sketched out here. And he's particularly scathing of them because in his terms they fail to learn to love the monsters that we create by virtue of living on the planet. There's this notion that we can somehow extricate humans from the planet, create some kind of pure wildernesses. So in the final section of the paper, I want to focus on Latour's appeal to learn to love the monsters of modernity, as it seems most in keeping with the ethos, I think, of this event. This isn't a kind of escapist fantasy. There is a sense we need to work with animals in the city to get at the monstrousness of the urban in various ways. So on the one hand, I think we can find in rewilding a new conceptual framework for thinking about urban wildlife. Here, wildlife comprises novel ecosystems which are dynamic, non-linear, humanised, with multiple future natures. In some cases, this model has liberated conservationists to imagine more ambitious and future-orientated ecological baselines. So the Oostvaardersplassen shows us examples of efforts to network wildlife back into the everyday spaces of people's lives. But ultimately, this site is geared towards creating what they call the Serengeti behind the dikes. It's sort of steeped in a kind of wilderness ideology. This was a blue chip wildlife film they made recently, in which great efforts have been made to kind of airbrush out the trains and airbrush out the pylons and airbrush out urbanity in all of its glory, I think. Advocates are ambivalent about the polar's monstrous origins, and this ambivalence risks overlooking or even denigrating the parks, the gardens, and other feral biologies, to use Anna Singh's terms in her great recent book, that make up the common wilds. So, for the last bit, I want to turn to a different example, which I find from work I've been doing recently with urban conservationists trying to make a space for rot and decay in the city. So I first got acquainted with rot and its possibilities in a Gothic Victorian churchyard in South London in the early 2000s. This site was especially rotten, with old trees, broken tombs, neglected bodies. Our special interest there was deadwood insects, busy decomposers that break down fallen trees. The stag beetle was our talisman mini-beast, a charismatic flagship for an arc of neglected creepy crawlies. Undermanaged graveyards had emerged as stag beetle hotspots, and we were there to count the beetles, to put decay on the map, and to try and build popular support for rot and decay in urban ecologies. We were giving out leaflets and encouraging people to build stag beetle log piles and nesting boxes. But of course, rot is rarely an aspirational term or an aesthetic phenomenon. Rot seemed out of place in the modern visions of a pre-crisis London. Stag beetles and dead wood were at risk, we learned, from a mania for greenwashing initiatives that had swept municipal park management and the fashions of private gardens. Rotten wood on brownfield land underpinned the utopian dreams of the then government, the New Labour government's vision of an urban renaissance. It threatened stagnation, slowness, disease. Rot reeked of mortality, of vulnerability, of the inevitability of death. To the annoyance of stag beetle enthusiasts and rewilders, old trees were being grubbed up, dead wood was being chipped and burnt, shit was being bagged, carcasses were being collected, unruly urban wilds were being entrained to linear geometries or the wholesome sanitised curves of heritage tourism. But of course, rot seems to persist on the margins. It's there in the edgelands or the blasted landscapes and unofficial countrysides, built, abandoned and ruined in the serendipitous crises of our modern economy. And I think we saw that nicely yesterday in Joyce's reflections on Buffalo and the kind of cities of post-industrial decline. It's there in the homesteads abandoned in the rural margins. And of course, on closer inspection, we can find rot all over, in the scruffy bits of land around railways, motorways and airports. Rot happens amidst landfills, substations, sewage works, and other eyesores of modern infrastructure that some of us are not supposed to see. Okay, so that was back in the sort of early 2000s. Writing now, a decade later, and in much less optimistic times for urban planners, at least in the UK, it would appear that my stag beetle enthusiasts were in the vanguard of a shift that seems to have taken place in urban conservation. The stag beetle nesting boxes, which at the time seemed such token acts of care, now speak of a wider affection for rot and decay. An awareness of the novel ecosystems of the Anthropocene that I talked about earlier seems to be driving a reappraisal of the ecological and functional roles of disturbance. Floods, fire, storms, diseases and pests are increasingly understood as both disastrous and generative components of dynamic ecological systems. There's a growing appreciation of the functional significance of deadwood, of its decomposing denizens and the disturbance regimes that bring them into being. So in parks, gardens and wider woodlands, scientists, managers and citizens work to nurture desired forms of rot. Fallen trees may now be left to decay in situ. Urban river managers flag the positive roles of stream channel deadwood for flood prevention. Experiments are underway to return herbivores as ecological engineers whose browsing and grazing will restore decomposition. Beavers, cows and horses are charged with felling or damaging trees, making space for rot, and it's hoped that these animals might be left to die in the wild to return carcasses and dead meat vital for scavengers. Eating apples in the graveyard in the company of a decrepit botanist, so this is thinking back to that first encounter with rot, I was also given a more profound lesson in urban wildlife. Waving a windfall apple, she traced the apple's possible molecular history, from subterranean human corpse broken by bacteria, carried in the body of the worm to the reaching roots. lifted high to branch to bud to fruit, a bite, a chew, a swallow, and after some acidic digestion into me. From human to humus to human again, through a humorous rotten epiphany. It was a sense of connection that came out from eating the apple. Later, waiting alone under the apple tree in the gloom, I experienced a creepy eeriness. I looked for beetles amidst a pungent buzzing and crawling invertebrate host, gorged on wood fed from Victorian bodies. It struck me that both stag beetle and I were urban zombies, well-fed forms of the dead made living. We were both raised on rotten flesh, transient forms in a microcosmos of perpetual incorporation. So spending time with stag beetles and their people in graveyards taught me that learning to live well with rot, both within and without our bodies, might offer ways of becoming responsible zombies in the muddy brown ecologies of the Anthropocene. Nurturing, tolerating, controlling rot is suggestive of probiotic arts for eating, living, and shitting well in the Anthropocene. It's suggestive of ways of learning to love our monsters that don't require the oxymoronic decoupling of the urban and the wild. Thank you.
Jamie, I'm sure we have many questions about becoming responsible zombies. So open it up to anyone who has such questions. Got one back? Yeah.
So this might actually be something that we should talk to with the architects in the room later on, but so many of the times, like, we're building the urban or certain major buildings that are supposed to last more than 100 years. And it's kind of hard to do that if you're introducing rot, even though that would be much more healthy for the urban ecosystem. And even just, plant roots breaking apart brick and mortar. So I would just say, have you come across ways that we can sort of do this in places that aren't on the margins where we're actually doing that in urban? I mean, maybe green roofs is sort of the only example I can think of, but have you heard of other examples?
I mean, certainly with the dead wood, which is somewhat an easier form of rot, that kind of mania for mature trees and cut green grass is a fairly easy thing to shift, I guess. I mean, there are kind of health and safety concerns about strangers hiding in the woods or trees falling on people's heads and all the rest of it, but that seems to be a largely aesthetic rather than a kind of rational decision that dead branches need to be cleared away. And I've seen that shifting in various ways. Some of those sites that we saw yesterday, these kind of, what they call the areas that are set back from the road, almost exclusively seem to be given over to grass. You could have all sorts of dead wood piles in there, which potentially wouldn't be any more difficult to manage or any more risky. So yeah, I think there's opportunities there. Obviously, in the fabric of our homes, there are structural health dimensions to this. Some fungi are deeply horrible, mold. You don't want them in your house, so it's not a kind of complete embrace of rot, but I think there are ways of kind of making space in a kind of more measured fashion into the urban fabric.
Well, yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. One thing I was wondering, you talked a little bit about the sort of political economies of rot in London, and I was just wondering about the Oostvaardersplassen. Sometimes in some of my research, I've come across this pattern where some of the restoration ecology tactics, conservation biology, and rewilding is very kind of convenient neoliberal tactic in the sense that we don't need to spend money on maintenance, put a fence up and keep the poor people out. Sort of comes in tandem with the withdrawal of the state. And so I was wondering how that played out, because obviously building a wildlife overpass takes a lot of expenditures. I don't know if those are public-private partnerships and how those things happen. And then in that context, what the relationship is in terms of, sometimes the Netherlands, I don't know a lot about the political landscape, but sometimes, I think about the rise of the far right in Europe and how that plays out in the Netherlands vis-a-vis these rewilding projects, if that was something that came up in your research at all.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a much longer project that we've been doing, thinking about the history of rewilding through Europe in the 20th century, and it definitely touches on bigger geopolitical ideas about what wildness is. So those het cattle I showed, the cows that were introduced into the Ursprungsklassen were backbred by two zoologists with Nazi patronage in the 1920s because Goering wanted to introduce them into the annexed territories of Eastern Europe once they'd been cleared of people. They survived the war, they re-emerged as these kind of cosmopolitan figures for grazing that have been distributed around Europe. But this is still a central, this is still a Western European organisation telling what people in marginal areas of Eastern Europe want to do, and it's resisted on those grounds, albeit within a European state. People aren't abandoning the land willingly. So there's a kind of broader political ecology in which rewilding is playing out in the European context. The Dutch, are famously keen on planning, famously, fairly high taxation, quite good at, sponsoring green infrastructure. The same can't be said, for other areas of Europe in that way, which include struggling economically in that fashion. So yeah, we want to see this in the round. Rot has all sorts of resonance in terms of land abandonment and decay, in a kind of cultural sense. The processes through which large numbers of people are leaving areas of Eastern Europe are fairly unpleasant. People see that as a very negative thing. Old people left behind, culture's rotting. There's a metaphorical significance that you can really explore in different locations. So yeah, you're right. There's much bigger economic questions that we need to situate this within.
So, back there.
Thank you, Jamie, for that really interesting talk. I have a question in terms of the example of rewilding in Netherlands. It seems to be a very extreme case of humans being engineers of nature. And I was wondering, I feel like the fields of urban planning, urban design, to some extent architecture, especially when it deals with nature and as well as wildlife management, that in those roles in that field, we are playing engineers of nature and environment. We're always trying to modify it, adjust it to our needs. I was wondering, do you have any suggestions of how do we move away from this anthropocentric kind of perspective in our fields that seems to be like the base of our fields and fundamental to our fields?
Okay, it's a really good question. There's a Dutch philosopher called Joseph Koolhaas who's written a really nice piece talking about rewilding, and he describes it as controlled decontrolling, which I think is quite a helpful a combination of words. And I guess the argument is in the Anthropocene, if we accept the premise of the Anthropocene that humans are geological actors, then not taking some initiative is as bad as taking the wrong sorts of initiative. There's a responsibility inherent in shaping the planet. And his argument is that the kind of command and control model, which we tended to think of for natural resource management, but also tended to dominate conservation. We've got a list of species, if we can count and manage to all species, tends to create a whole set of problems. And the controlled decontrolling is about making space for processes to occur in situations where we don't really know what complex ecological systems are going to be. It's easier to do it in Ursprungsklassen because you can fence it off. It's been happening accidentally in places like Detroit, just through abandonment. It's the same under very less controlled fashions, but how we think about control in that setting. But I think to think of it as controlled decontrolling, there's an anthropologist called Heather Paxson who's talked in a very different setting about people working on their microbiome, taking bacteria to boost their immune system. She talks about post-Pasteurian approaches to thinking about hygiene. Pasteur was all about control, it was all about eradication. In some ways, this is a kind of post-Pasteurian approach to thinking about wildlife. We're not going to sanitize it, we're not going to discipline it, we're going to let it do its thing within certain boundaries of control.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk, Jamie. I had two kind of related questions, and I keep coming back to this idea of this sort of overall crash in biodiversity on the geologic time frame. And I'm wondering if we need another term other than rewilding, because it seems to me with I agree with you on that whole engineering, it's human intervention to produce a kind of vision of nature that's sort of, I heard the term living fossils used. It's this sort of creating of a theme park of the wilderness. And we still have peoples on the planet who live, I'm thinking of First Nations and their struggles over territory in Canada, where human intervention isn't about trying to perpetuate a certain imaginary, it's actually just a living collaboration with species that they use. So we have that on the one hand, this sort of creation of these theme park-like environments, and then on the other, this turn, and I'm complicit in this, are thinking about the urban and kind of rejoicing in biodiversity where we see it, even though the overall level of biodiversity is also falling there. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, but I guess I'm with you on, it's so easy to tell miserable stories about it.
Yeah.
And conservation's got so far telling miserable stories.
Yeah.
And it's also so easy for us as social scientists to shoot conservation down
Yeah.
because it adheres
Yeah.
to kind of versions of nature that are authentic. And I've tried to resist
Yeah,
those
no,
two
I think we
temptations.
need more conservation, not, I mean,
Yeah.
I would imagine that there are conservation ecologists who have a different
Sure, and it
way of operating than.
So I've had to rewrite rewilding against the grain here, and I'm trying to kind of nudge it by working with it rather than sort of prescribing what it ought to be by saying what it is in that way. But you're right. I mean, wildness is very much a category that belongs to certain types of people and not other types of people. It doesn't make sense in many parts of the world. I think if any of these ridiculous de-extinction schemes would be creating fossils, and I think they shouldn't be encouraged. What they're doing with the cattle and horses, which are kind of functional grazers that have good genetic diversity, have good sort of ranges of behavioural types, I'm less concerned about the kind of the welfare or the ecological dimensions of those. But yeah, bringing back a mammoth, sticking it in Siberia, that wouldn't be a mammoth. It would be some weird kind of Frankenstein thing that would then only abandoned in that sort of way. So,
I may be bringing up a similar couple of critiques because I feel struck by the Netherlands example, and it just seems to me that it's playing on that similar duality of the urban is over here, the wildlife is over there, and it's romanticizing a lot of the propaganda for the rewilding of Europe. And so I was just curious if you could comment on this following point, that I feel that Europe has a number of complex metal ecosystems, for example, that are the result of years, centuries of human land use activity. And so this whole dichotomy of this and there, do you have a comment on perhaps that sort of integration of human activity with complex ecosystems?
I mean, it's a really good point, and the politics around rewilding in Europe is to do with whether or not we should be subsidising low-intensity agricultural systems that deliver those landscapes. So those landscapes are there because long histories, long but not that long, but relatively long, histories of low-intensity land use, which in the kind of globalised agricultural system are no longer economically viable. They have great cultural significance and have ecological significance. Vera's experiment was supposed to show that the natural ecosystem of Europe after the last ice age was a shifting forest pasture landscape, so it would be much more open than the high forest, which had up till now been the kind of assumed paleoecological norm. And if you accept that the landscape was much more open, then it wasn't people who opened up the forest to create biodiversity, it was the herbivores who opened up the forest. And therefore you don't need to pay people to keep the forest open because the herbivores will do it for you. Now if you're a farmer, that's bad news, because in some ways the way that farming has squared the circle of the tension between farming and conservation is to say, well, if we weren't there, the forest would grow back and the biodiversity would disappear. And Vera and others have been running Europe saying, forget about farmers, the big animals will do it. So it plays to a kind of neoliberal context in which we can cut the common agricultural policy, which is what subsidised farming, stick the big animals in there, farmers can disappear to the city or they can all become game wardens and tourist lodge managers. So there's a big politics about whether this hypothesis is correct or not, because the whole subsidy regime is based on the fact of what was there 10,000 years ago.
I actually wanted to just say I have a problem with the term Anthropocene because Anthro has been here for thousands and thousands of years, but presumably the Anthropocene has only occurred relatively recently, corresponding with a specific economic model of capitalism. So I think it would be much more appropriate to tag the age to the economic system rather than to blame humans when in fact the system is designed for, the 1% or whatever as Occupy would have called it.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of debate initiated by the term as to what would be the correct label.
Yeah.
So there are folk who suggest it should be called the capitalist scene.
Yeah.
There are some
That's right.
who want to call it the plantation scene that is associated with
Right.
rise of colonialism.
Yeah.
There's a kind of early Anthropocene group who say it stems from the kind of Pleistocene overkill, so way back in the history of Anthro, before
Right. Or the plow, but
at the moment, this is the only label that's offered to us. I mean, the working group should be deciding this year whether or not, or they put their proposal to the commission. Hypothetically, they could come up with another label to suggest what the epoch should be. But yeah, it's by no means the best descriptor. It's very politically laden, it's very gendered, etc.
Yeah.